All right, gonna get started on the lecture 2, unit 3. We're on the economy again. We're gonna look at today a really short period of time. So we're gonna look at just the Depression itself, which was really about a decade-long period of time. Great Depression, what was the Great Depression? You all know this. What was it?
The stock market crash.
Stock market crash. So why did that make things bad?
Because money was like worthless and people were just like burning it. And it was hard to buy things.
Yeah, people were burning stocks. Yeah, this was a bottom falling out period. So in unit 3, we're looking at disruptions, right? So last time we looked at the way in which the state became kind of this new owner of its land. It enlisted it not just as it had before, which was to sort of use resources and make them available for the economy. It actually used it to put people to work. And it used it as a vehicle for recovering our economy from this set of circumstances. New Deal, big change in government, small change in government. What's your guess on that? Big change in government, small change in government?
I'd say it was a small change in government.
A small change. Why would you say that?
I don't know, because I don't feel like it affected the government that much.
The New Deal. Is that everyone's general impression? FDR's? Shantes? Come on in, it's
I'd say
okay.
it was a big change.
Why would you say that?
I believe this was like the switch of political parties itself.
Yeah, it's huge. So this is going to be, and we'll see this next week, the sort of Democratic ascendancy. The Democrats who we know today show up in this period of time. So there's a significant shift in party power, and the electorate that's keeping the party in power. So in that sense, we certainly see something new crystallize. The government itself, New Deal, small government, big government, how would you think?
It was very big government
And why would you think that?
because instead of just creating an environment for business, they made business. They started hiring people themselves and putting them to work.
Okay, yeah, we see the federal government get involved in everyday lives. And the question, really two questions, and we'll end on these. One, how big was it? Like, what are we talking about in terms of the change in the size of the federal government and its role in the economy? And we want to ask ourselves, was this integration in the economy an appropriate move, right? Is this something that Americans feel comfortable with in terms of what their government's role should be in American life? It was a resounding yes in the 1930s, absolutely a resounding yes that this should happen. Overwhelming elections, overwhelming majorities for FDR and his New Deal through the New Deal, which is what we'll look at today, continues into World War II. Wild support for the Democrats, wild support for this program. But what was it? Why did it come into being? And why did it happen? Just to get us located, there's our map again. We're on that little tiny short period of time from about 1929 to about 1941. Why would I go to 1941? What happens in 1941?
World War II.
Yeah, World War II, right? And so we begin to see, instead of the programs of the New Deal and these efforts at intervention in the economy impacting things, we see the war impacting things, and it's a completely different ballgame at that point. 6 parts today are going to move through. I want to talk a little bit about the fall itself, like what are we falling from, what happened. Hoover, I want to recover Hoover just a little bit. We often think of him as the guy who did nothing. He did some things, and he did things that probably made good sense at the moment. The paradigm was shifting in the early 30s. We're going to look in some detail at why it kept falling out, like what was actually happening, what were the mechanics of this, and then the impacts of the Great Depression, Roosevelt and his New Deal, just some parts of it we want to remember. I'm going to come back to the politics next week, but there were really 2 New Deals. There was a New Deal that was the first 100 days of 1933, where it was just about stopping the bleeding, and there was a second New Deal of 1936, which was much more radical in terms of the legislation and in terms of the things that the government did. And both of those as interventions in the economy. As we come into the 20th century, it gets more and more difficult to separate out the different parts of the story here. So last time I was talking about the environment, but it was impossible to avoid talking about the New Deal and the war and the role of the federal government in that. Today I'm going to be talking about the economy. It's impossible to talk about the Great Depression without also talking about the government and the government's role in that. And that's because in the 20th century, increasingly these elements of life are becoming intertwined with each other. It's hard to think about the economy without the government without the environment, etc., etc. So just a couple quick recaps we remember over the long term. So we started in our economic lectures looking at what we saw as a productive revolution and this punctuated growth. This idea that we see these bursts of growth and then a bit of a recession. Bursts of growth and then a recession. And so here's the chart we looked at a few weeks back, and we notice there's a recession in the 70s and a little fall, but not a whole lot of a fall. Another one in the 80s. A bigger one in the 90s, an even larger one at the beginning of the 20th century. These sort of punctuated falls are a part of the system itself, right? So capitalism has a tendency to overreach. It has a tendency to grow beyond its capacity and then collapse on itself. And we see these are called Kuznets cycles. These kind of regenerative cycles where it overreaches and then it innovates and it does something different. We see a whole new innovation coming into this economy in the 20th century. So the second lecture, the Unit 2 lecture on the economy, looked at mass production. What was different with mass production from the production that came in the 19th century in terms of the nature of production? How were they different from one another?
It gave jobs to like everyone because they were simpler. So like you could do like a bunch of the same thing over and over.
Yeah, it so expanded the opportunity. It created a whole lot more entry-level jobs. It also produced a whole lot more stuff, right? It created an economy that was an economy of consumption. And in fact, our workers and our middle class became consumers. And so this is just the GDP of the United States. It's in 1990 dollars. What do you notice about that? Date along the bottom. What do you see there? Anything jump out?
There was a dip in the 1930s.
Yeah. So when we talk about the Great Depression, so we see this is our punctuated economy. There's the 1893. You don't even see the blips on a line like this for the dips that came earlier in the 19th century. Nothing like this and nothing since then, okay? So this huge dip, but you also notice that there was a huge acceleration, right? So if you were to draw a line all the way through it, you get a straight line through this, but not without this major disruption. Significant disruption or depression, right? We call it a depression because it actually is a depression of the line itself. This you don't understand without understanding the 20s. Okay, the 1920s and the 1920s economy. This was an economy where, unless you were black, upward mobility was pretty good. You could move into the bottom. You could hope for your son or your grandchildren to be in a better economic position than you were. We see the middle class growing in this economy, thriving, right? And we see this emergence, mass culture. So not only is everybody becoming more of a consumer, but they're doing so in this shared public way, right? We're all kind of together as consumers starting in the 20s, sharing in this mass culture of film and cinema, but also a mass culture of consumption. So we see the rise of these supermarket chains and these branded items that become the mark of your own status, in a sense, right? So having a radio means that you're middle class, and so you want to buy a radio. Having other items show off your sense of presence in this culture. And this is the remarkable thing about the consumer culture, is it depends on us fulfilling our needs out there in the economy. So if you we saw this a couple weeks ago, but if you read the Lucky Strike ad, it basically says, ladies, you can stay thin by smoking. Okay? Here's a good way to stay trim and fit out there. So it's playing on our own identities, and we often forget that because it's a part of all of our lives at this point, but that we're consumers, and we're taught to be consumers by this wash of advertisement that says you need to wear the right things, you need to smoke the right cigarettes, you need to drink the right Coca-Cola, you need to do the things that make you a part of this culture. And that's a new kind of social pressure, and it's being for the first time pressed on people by advertisement. Advertisements telling people what they can have, and that they ought to be getting it, what they should participate in, what they need to have the right home, etc. You remember when we looked at the outdoor movement in the 1920s, that was all about a whole bunch of people sort of following the path of consumerism. Now we're supposed to take our cars and buy our stuff and go outdoors and camp in this way. All of this, though, depended on the constant consumption of consumers. It depended on a constant outlay into the economy. And it was quickly evident to those who were mass producing things like automobiles or refrigerators or radios that consumers weren't going to be able to buy them just with their salary alone. And so we see emerge in this era consumer credit, right? This idea that you've got to have the automobile, but you might not have the money right now to buy it in cash. But if you got $25 and you've got a job, so I can count on your future income, you can come into possession of this item. And so this becomes this increasing way of, and let's face it, people do it today. We know the people who have the car that they really can't afford and the phone that they really can't afford because they could get it on credit and they can try to pay it off over time, right? We get the goods so that we can be the people that we need to be in that consumptive economy. And we sell our future, in a sense. We say, yeah, we'll buy this over time. I'll have this car for 10 years before I actually own the car. At which point I'll own it, but it won't be worth anything. But I've gotten 10 years of use out of it, right? And we see this across the economy. Consumer credit for household items, large object items, large price items, smaller priced items, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, etc., becomes commonplace. It hadn't been there before. You've all grown up in an era where it's ubiquitous and you just count on it. You're gonna have a credit card. You're gonna buy things. You're gonna buy that car over 5 years. You're not gonna pay for it for cash up front. By the end of the 1920s, this use of credit spread into the stock market. And this was part of the problem that was faced, was that even company stocks could be purchased on credit. What are you buying company stock on credit? Why would anyone sell you company stock on credit? If you're buying an automobile, okay, I'll buy an automobile new with a down payment because I can drive away with that automobile and I can use it while I'm paying for it so that it becomes valuable immediately to me. What's the value of a stock? Why would you buy stock on credit? Any idea? Any idea?
As you're waiting to pay for it, you can wait for it to accumulate value.
Yeah, okay, so really the only reason you'd want to buy stock on credit is the stock market's going up. And there's a chance for you to somehow make up the difference between what you paid and what that stock's worth when you finally paid it up. It's not worth anything else, right? It's only worth its cash value, whether it goes up or down. So we get to the end of the 1920s and we've seen steady growth. There was a dip in the depression in 1920-21 and then just an acceleration of growth. That included a growth in the stock market, that included a growth in just general economic activity. They were called the Roaring Twenties because people were spending a lot of money and spending money that they didn't have, but it was flush. It was a flush time. And in 1928, Herbert Hoover, who was a well-respected statesman at this point, and a Republican, a mining engineer, and just a well-established public servant even, becomes president in an overwhelming election. Smith was a Catholic. He won in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and then the South. He was a Democrat, and so it's the Solid South Democrats at play for the last time against Republicans. Within 10 months, within 9 months of his inauguration, Wall Street crashes and it comes crashing down. There was an indication in July of 29 that stocks might be falling, but the banks jumped in and paid some money into the stock market and kept them afloat. Anybody who knew anything said, like people say today about the student loan bubble, and like people said in 2007 about the housing bubble, the economy's inflated. Like there's just too much credit out there. We got too many people who owe and not enough income. And so folks who knew that it was precarious, but your average citizen didn't. They were continuing to participate in all of this. And the stocks came tumbling down. So if we look at that's up through 31. If we look at just the months, the first months after the crash, it was just an immediate collapse of stock prices. But then it seemed in November a rebound. It looked like things were getting better. So Hoover convinced the railroads and a couple of large industries, just keep spending. He said this is going to be like 2021. It's going to be about a year. Things will adjust as they need to, and then things will come back. He also lowered the federal interest rate. Why would you lower a federal interest rate? What does that do?
To encourage people to pay back.
Well, if money's cheap from the feds, what's going to happen?
People borrow.
People borrow. So it's to encourage banks to borrow more money, to put more money in the economy, right? What we need is flow. We need cash flow. He got Congress to sign a $100 million farmer relief bill because, as we know, farmers have had it bad. They keep having it bad. They haven't had it good in the United States since before the 1840s, basically. So there's money to go out to these farmers who have been in trouble since the early 20s. And he raised the tariff, right? Raises the tariff to protect the American economy. It just did no good. There would be a little bit of a blip back and then a fall. So this gets us all the way to 1933. These are outstanding loans. The banking industry literally just collapsed. It didn't collect back these loans. It lost this money altogether. Just this sort of constant, steady erosion. And here's another look at the fall. So this is the fall in value of stock prices. So between 1929 and 1932, it literally just bottomed out. The stock market became valueless. Did not come back. We just look a little bit further. Started to come back in 32, got to a peak in 37, and then started to fall again until about 1940. So what was wrong with the economy? Well, we've looked at this before. Price to earnings ratio, that means how much is the stock worth, how much is the company making? And as you get up into that higher than 20%, your stock is far too overvalued. And so we've got a situation where there's too much value in the stocks themselves. And in fact, this was a situation that was because of the margin buying of stocks, right? So stocks on credit was called margin buying. You'd go to a stockbroker and you'd say, I'd like $100 in stock, here's $10. He'd take the $10, give you the $100 in stock, and then you'd pay him back the remaining $90 with interest over the next 9 months or so. this was absolutely commonplace. By the late 1920s, 90% of the value in the stock market itself, 90% of that peak, we can go back to this for 1 minute, right? 90% of what's up there in that peak isn't money at all. It's money that's loaned, it's money that's in the future, it's your own future that's been cast up there. So 90% of the stock value came from borrowed money, which means it's waiting on someone else's future to ultimately be paid for. And then 40 cents of every dollar that was loaned out, 40 cents of every dollar the bank is sending out is being spent on stocks. So all of this floated money, all of this future money goes into the stock exchange. So let's look at what that looked like on the individual level, because it was a series of individual choices and individual decisions that ultimately brought about the disaster. So trust me on the math here. You don't have to get it all down. Let's walk through the principles. We've got our stockbroker. At the top, Joe Public, that's you and me. At the bottom, we go after $100 in stock. We're gonna borrow $90 from that stockbroker at 6% to get $100 in stock. He's getting $90 from me. I've paid $10. I've got a $90 debt, and I've got $100 in stock. This is what Americans saw through the 1920s. Stocks are going up, so what happens the next month? The next month I pay off, I've paid $20, but my stock's gone up to $105. It's raising 5% a month. I'm making my debt payment, I've got to pay interest, $540 plus minus the $10, so my debt's gone down to $85.40. The next month the stock goes up again. Now I've got $110 in stock. I'm making money on that stock I don't even own yet, and I'm paying off my debt. I get down to $80.52. I go into the next month, again an increase in 5%. I'm making money and I'm getting my debt paid down. So if we walk just this simple debt out to the end, this is the table, 5% increase in the stock price, 6% debt or interest on my payment. I end up at the end of this with a stock worth $188 that I only paid $100. Well, I paid $133 for, which means I walk away with a profit. So does my stockbroker, because in my interest I've paid him $43, which means that just in this exchange of I'm going to pay you later for this and I'm going to ride the economy, we've added almost $100 of new wealth to the economy. So everything ticks upward, right? This is a fantastic situation. This is what people were riding. Your stock is now worth more. You can sell it off and take that cash. If you turn around stocks in 5 or 6 months because of the rapid increase, you can make a lot of money. And people were making a lot of money, grabbing, flipping, buying on credit, and then paying off and walking away with a profit even though they didn't have but $10 to put down. Works really well when the economy's going well, right? But what happens when that arrow turns downward? And this is what happened suddenly in 1929. So you start out, I'm going to borrow same $90 at 6% for $100. I'll put $10 down, $90 credit. I've got $100 in stock. I've paid $10 and I owe $90. Only the stock market went down 5%, which means that the second month I'm paying now my $20, but my stock's fallen by $5, and I still have the debt that I'm paying off. Third month, my stock goes down to 90. I'm losing money at this point. Like I haven't even paid off that $100, and that note is worth $10 less than what I paid for it, and I still have a debt on it. And so we grind this situation forward, $85. By the end of paying this off, my stock, oh, I've got the wrong number up there. My stock has fallen off. Oh, I put the wrong table in. My stock has fallen. End of the day, ignore the numbers on that side. I've lost $80. The economy itself has lost $40, but my stockbroker still walks away with money because I'm paying him the dollars. When stocks start to fall in this way, what happens is the broker stops the deal. The broker does what's called a call on the deal. So maybe it happens in the 4th month, maybe it happens in the 3rd month, but he says, you need to pay the difference in this. And this was often the deal with the stockbrokers, was you've got a debt that you owe. If stocks go down, we don't want to ride a bad market. We want our cash out. We want the money you owe right away. So they make a call on the debt. You need to settle the 80-52. You've paid $110.52 at that point for a stock that's worth $85.74. Right, so your stockbroker walks away with money. This is why people didn't like stockbrokers. You walk away with a loss. You've lost money. Ross.
When the student loan thing happens, what will that if that implodes? What will
Well, that's trillions, and it will be like what happened in 2007, which means that the value will fall out of the economy. So, and I'll walk through some of what does it mean when the value disappears? It means your savings accounts disappears, right? So it means if you've got investments in a 401k, they're invested in, that's what they're investing in, is the stock market. That collapses, your $500 portfolio is now worth $50, right? So you see all of your investments shrink because they're dependent on the growth itself. So this call comes in the 4th month. You're owning that stock. What are you going to do, you think, to settle that debt? What's your best move? Borrow more money? What do you do? Nobody's going to Wall Street, I see.
Sell your stock.
Why would you sell your stock? It's still, right, yeah, right? It's worth still more than I owe. And this is what people would say. Well, okay, I'm still at this point where I can make money. Let me sell my stock, right? I can at least get out of this thing not holding on to a bad note, pay off, take my debt, walk away. And that's in fact what Joe Public would do. And that's what happened in 1929, was all these calls came in and everybody said, well, I gotta pay for it, I gotta sell my stock. And then everybody starts to sell their stock. And so it's not just one person, it's not just 4 people, it is the entire market suddenly going, as this collapses, I've got to cover my debts, I've got to liquidate what I have. Well, what happens when you liquidate a market like this? The market collapses, right? And so this was literally this rapid liquidation through these punctuations over several months. You see the impact. So what this is the overnight loan rate, percentage rate for the federal bank. That tells you what that percentage rate is going to be that you're going to be able to borrow money at to buy anything. You see what happens in 1929. It spikes. It goes well up over 6%. It makes all loans too expensive for anyone to take. And the stock market itself starts this crashing downward spiral. And so October, November, coming into December, and then it seemed like it was going to rebound. It was going to come back. And this is where Hoover's saying, don't worry, it's going to be just like 1921. He didn't realize how much inflation was in the market. And so that first bump is that this recovery that he sees, and then it goes down again. And it was torturous, because if you believed, like Hoover did, that the economy was going to adjust, that it was going to settle, every time you see this increase, you have hope. It's coming back. It's coming back. So he had reason for not doing anything more, and had a faith that the economy was somehow going to adjust. We've never been in a situation where that much consumer credit was out on the economy itself. This was a brand new set of circumstances. And so this 90% of the stock value, and this is what Hoover simply couldn't see himself. But there's 40% of your loans, and there's 90% of your stock market. That's most of your value in your economy. And so over the course of 3 years, this steady, erosive process literally wiped out what was the American economy, wiped it out from the bottom. So your life savings disappeared. You saved your whole life, they're gone. Company operating funds, like companies often take short-term loans in order to stay afloat. They can no longer stay afloat. They can't meet payroll. This 1930, and Hoover says, it's gonna get better, it's gonna get better. And then 1931, and let's get a loan out to the farmers, and let's see if we can find some other ways to stave this off. But he kept saying, just be calm. Things are gonna be okay. Things are gonna turn better. 1932, right? The bottom just continues to fall out. And so by 1932, by the election of 1932, Americans are saying this is not the right way to deal with this situation, right? We've got 20 to 25% unemployment, higher than that in cities themselves. This is what Hoover was facing. So 29 is where the blue line begins. This is your unemployment. It just spikes. 30, 31, 32. The rate just keeps going up. No matter what Hoover says, the economy keeps getting worse. Unlike anything anybody had experienced before, it was a deeper dip than the Depression of 1893, which was up until that point considered the Great Depression, wiped it out altogether, and people increasingly began to believe there wasn't a hope of recovery. Right? We see just this increasing despair. We see bread lines, coffee lines, soup lines appearing in our cities. Hoover got his name appropriated for what were called Hoovervilles. And these were the shanty towns that started to appear around cities because people couldn't pay their rent and were moving out of their houses and were in real serious despair. So Hoovervilles appear everywhere. And this had a personal impact. So if we can think about a few different individuals and how this kind of economic distress impacts them, and then think about them as representative of the millions of people who are out of work. We can talk about John Norris, who was an iron worker, right? Working class, aspirational. He had taken his life's savings and he invested in an apartment building because real estate seemed like a good way to go. So in 1927, he doesn't invest in the stock market. He says, I'm buying a building. I'm getting into real estate and I'm going to gather the rent. I'm going to gather from my tenants. With the Depression, by 1930, his tenants could no longer pay him rent. And so he had to start evicting them, and he couldn't find other tenants because they were all laid off, just like he was. So what happens when you own a building and your rent stops coming in? Oh shoot, he didn't buy the building in cash. He bought the building with a loan. He had a mortgage on it. So he can't pay his mortgage. So he goes 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and the bank says, you can't not pay on this mortgage anymore, and they take the building back and kick him out. So no life savings, no building any longer either. He's gone bankrupt. And so his family essentially became homeless and ended up moving out into a shanty town for about 2 years before he got into a work program under the New Deal, right? So real aspirations, the bottom falls out. We can talk about Rose Majewski. She was a Polish worker who worked 2 jobs. She cleaned banks at night and she cut off chickens' heads during the day. She had to work 2 jobs because her husband had divorced her in 1925. The women's liberation of 1925 left her as a single mother. When the Depression set in by 1930, she lost both her jobs. All of a sudden, 2 kids, a rent, no income whatsoever. She'd been making about $30 a week in the 2 jobs themselves. So she just began going house to house, taking whatever work she could get, cleaning, helping out in the yard, etc. So she went from $30 a week to about $4 a week, just begging from people in order to scrape by, get money into her kids' bellies. And she'd made a little more money than average, and so she had savings. But by 1931, she'd spent through every cent of savings that she had as well, and she was not getting anything new in. She stopped paying her insurance, so she no longer was insured, and that lapsed. like I said, she spent down her savings, and then she had to stop paying her rent, and she and her children got kicked out of their house and ended up living in an abandoned barn for about 2 years before the New Deal came along and started providing some support for them as well. But she waited in bread lines for food every day for her kids in 1931 and 1932, and just didn't have enough money to make it. Or we could talk about George Patterson, who was a steel worker who believed that the Depression wasn't going to impact him at all. In fact, he was so confident in 1931 he got married. He said, this is going to be for other people. But by 1932, his plant, which had been doing well up to that point, shut down, unemployed the entire crew, and he was reduced to working 1 day a month and suddenly couldn't support his family either. He had invested in a company program that was called corporate welfare, and I'll talk about this next week, where the company said, instead of putting your money into a union or putting your money into the stock market, put it into our company, invest in our company, and that value would grow as you grow our company. Well, when the company went belly up, all of his savings invested in the company disappeared as well. He had bought company stock at about $260 a share. He had to liquidate them for about $20 a share in 1932. Also ended up homeless, also ended up in bread lines as well. There were literally millions of stories like this. Ordinary people, people who had been working hard, people who had worked hard, people who had done the right thing with their money, who had saved their money in right ways, and they couldn't do anything. By 1932, it appeared that there wasn't any hope for gainful employment to come along. And there wasn't any kind of, so some of these ethnic workers would have maybe 20 years earlier had an ethnic relief society in their community that they could turn to. Those were gone. They had disappeared in the mass culture and the modernization. There was literally nowhere to fall back, right? People were desperate, just seriously desperate. In the summer of 1932, several thousand desperate men, veterans of World War I, who had a pension that was promised to them by 1948. They had a piece of paper from the federal government that says, for your service in World War I, you will receive this payment. In 1948, they said, you know what, we need to get our bonus. It was called the World War I bonus. We need to get our bonus now. And they marched on Washington. There were several thousands of them. They camped outside of the Capitol building, and they demanded that the federal government pay them on their bonuses. These are the Capitol Police that Hoover called in to clear them out and clear them out of Washington. The federal government at that point in time would have nothing to do with these kinds of claims on them. Hoover was still saying, well, we might need to do more, but it'll adjust itself. Things will work out. Things will settle. But there was another candidate in 1932 who made an entirely different set of promises. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was of a progressive tradition. He believed that there was a role for the federal government to be involved in this, and he promised relief. He said, I'm going to bring a new deal. The federal government's going to get involved in this. We're not going to stand back and be hands off. And it was a wildly successful platform, as you can well imagine, right? He swept almost every state in the Union, except for a little bit of New England. He did so because the Democrats organized around a new coalition that was kind of the coalition of the harmed by this economy. Women who were still new voters at this point, labor, like laborers, these folks that I talk about, they said, well, you know, this company isn't doing right by me, but the federal government is saying that it will. Blacks, northern urban blacks, because southern blacks are still disenfranchised at this point. For the first time, farmers have a voice in Washington for the first time since before the Civil War. And then FDR also had the group of sort of left intellectuals around him. When he took office, the banks collapsed again. So 1933, he comes into office and people are not sure what's going on and they start making a run on the bank. And he called a bank holiday. This was unheard of for the federal government to suspend banks. And then he went on, and this isn't going to project over the loudspeaker, but I hope it's loud enough from here. And then he went on the radio. It's a little introduction.
C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government, created by cable in 1979.
During Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, he delivered a number of radio broadcasts which became known as fireside chats. President Roosevelt used these fireside chats to inform and build public support for his administration's efforts during the Great Depression, World War II, and the enactment of New Deal policies. Next, President Roosevelt's first fireside chat from March 12, 1933. This address was titled The Banking Crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the treasury regulations and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is fully sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets to the bank and convert them into cash, except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible in view of the requirement of time to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history.
So that goes on for about 10 more minutes, but what's he telling us? Shantaz.
When you deposit money into a bank, it does not just sit there, it does not just say for you, it's like,
Why is he explaining bank? This is his first fireside chat. Why is he explaining banking? What's he trying to do?
Maybe give people more faith in the system and the currency, which they don't have at this time.
Yeah, so stopping the running on the bank, explaining banking, like I don't know if you guys know, but your money is not sitting in a safe deposit box. It's mostly out there being reinvested. That's the fragility of a capital economy, right? Money doesn't sit still. It gets reinvested and reinvested. But if everybody wants their money at once from the bank, banks can't do that. They can never do that, right? That's a dangerous situation. So he's trying to make everybody kind of intelligent like his people are about the banks. Here's how they work. Here's what you need to do. You need to calm down. Does he leave you with a sense of calm or not? What's your read on him? Does he sound trustworthy? Sky, do you trust him? He sounds trustworthy, so maybe you won't run on the bank. Maybe this legislation, which seems like it's pretty heavy-handed, which is certainly not what the conservatives would do. Maybe it's actually an action that's on behalf of people. Maybe you'll trust him in his actions. He would do this again and again and again throughout the 1930s. Each time there would be legislation, each time there'd be large changes, he would literally try to speak to everyone through the radio. And this was the first time a president had really tried to come right into your rooms, right into your household, and say, come along with me on this thing that we're doing. Because this thing that he was doing was something the federal government had never done before. It shut down the banks, right? He passed this emergency banking legislation. It was the Banking Act of 1933, also known as Glass-Steagall. He created the FDIC, so now any deposit is going to be insured. The banks get secured by the federal government. More importantly, and probably its most important provision, was it separated commercial and investment banking. That meant that banks couldn't take your savings account and speculate on the stock market. People lost all of their life savings because banks had taken their savings account and speculated on the stock market. That Joe Public, he was borrowing money from you, even though you didn't know it. That's what was happening in that balloon. And so one of the most important pieces of banking legislation for the 20th century says you can't just take money and do what you want with it. We need to protect people's life savings. And so this also gave him powers to shut down the bank. It gave him powers to print money. It gave him enormous powers in the economy itself. Because behind this shutting down of the banks was some legislation that put people back to work. And we saw some of this last time as well. So the Public Works Administration, which ran from 33 to 35, so this is part of the first New Deal. It gets rendered unconstitutional in 1935 and gets remade as the Work Progress Administration, but for its 3 years in existence, it partnered with private companies and built 34,599 projects around the United States. Every single state in the Union, and these are sort of the examples of what was going on in each state. You could zoom into Ohio. This is just a zoom in of that. In Ohio, the Muckingham watershed was being re-engineered. Next door in Virginia, navigation on the Kawana River, the Ohio River down in Kentucky. These were all, you remember those large Army Corps of Engineer or Reclamation Service projects that required a whole lot of labor and got a whole lot of federal cash to put people to work. He also, in the first New Deal, asked industry to help as well. And so he passed the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933, which required that businesses paid fair wages. You couldn't underpay people. It also required that businesses charged fair prices. So all of a sudden, the federal government's getting in the middle of individual economic exchange, right? And so By 1935, that had been deemed unconstitutional as well. That was more than the federal government could do. But that first New Deal, that injection of millions of dollars back into the economy, into wages, into the CCC, into workers who were out building dams, straightening rivers, etc., it worked. So 1934 to 1937, you can see the unemployment rate, it peaks at about 21%, and it starts to fall after 1933. These pieces of legislation and this injection of money stopped the bleeding. It literally brought to an end this sudden rise in unemployment. And suddenly people are back at work again. Now, not all of them. We're still at a 14%, 14.5% unemployment. And there's going to be a bump in there right after the election. But this New Deal has changed everything. It's turned the economy around. And so FDR comes out in 1935 and runs again. You notice where he borrows from for his second election, from the World War I recruiting campaign, from the progressives. Keep him in, finish the job. Well, he did even better in 1936 than he did in 1932. And he was launched forward by increasing support from labor and this New Deal constituency, which was saying to him, you haven't gone far enough. You haven't done enough. And so in 1936, 1935, he launches his second New Deal. This act is still with us, the Social Security Act, that says every single salary, a little chunk of that comes out and goes into a savings account that people can draw off today. Old people, people with disabilities, people who've been injured. It's insurance for the weakest of us. And those are the people who are hurt worst by the economy itself. So not just these core workers, which is what that first New Deal dealt with, but a whole insurance package for people who weren't part of the workforce. We're going to move out of the workforce so that they didn't live in misery and poverty. Probably the most radical of the second New Deal acts was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act. So you kind of got to go back in time and think about this growing working class through the late 19th, early 20th century. It had been radical, it had tried to unionize in the workplaces where you had ethnic conclaves, you had a lot of unionization. The federal government had always opposed it. It had always opposed it until the progressive era when it said, well, we'd consider seeing if they have an argument, and a little bit of favor from Teddy Roosevelt. By 1935, the federal government says, you know what? There is a right to collective bargaining, and the federal government's going to protect it. No industry can prevent its workers from unionizing. They're allowed to come together, collectively organize, pool their money, and negotiate with industry for what they want as workers. So suddenly you've got the federal government propping up labor, propping up unions, and the AFL-CIO was the outcome of this. The American Federation of Labor, bound with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. These were all the laborers, unskilled laborers who were working in mass production, who didn't have a trade, who'd come in with no skill, were suddenly now being organized. And the AFL-CIO became a huge player in labor politics for the rest of the century. This is 1938. This is their major Congress when they realized their bounty. And the effects of this came very quickly. So labor in the auto industry initiated the great sit-down strike in the middle of the Depression. Things have just started to get better. And labor says, you know what, we want a better deal. And so they literally walk off the job around. It was General Motors and the other auto manufacturers, and then it spread to other industries. And they literally just shut down business. So we won't go back to work until we get a 40-hour work week, until we get a 5% increase in our salaries, and until these companies recognize our right to organize. And so we see the beginning of a very powerful labor organization that's protected by the federal government. Without the Wagner Act saying you have the right to do this and we will protect it, and we will take companies to court, we'll take them, we'll fine them for preventing this from happening, suddenly labor is empowered as well. The Work Progress Administration, which replaced the Public Works Administration, would build highways. This was also part of the second New Deal. Airports, bridges, dams, about 8.5 million men moved through this as well. Every state in the union, there are jobs, there are projects, and there's money flowing, and there's a sense of pride that's emerging around it as well. The despair that folks felt coming up into 1932, the sense of helplessness and hopelessness, was now filled with these opportunities. It wasn't making anybody rich, but nobody was getting poorer, and it was stabilizing the economy. And we see that we had increase in unemployment during those strike years, the early part of the second New Deal, and then it turned around again. And we start to see employment start to fall through 1939, 1940. You can see the same thing if we look at GDP. This is GDP in billions. So from 1929, it's just erasing. It's just value disappearing. The New Deal, it starts to put power back in the economy. There's a little blip in 37, and then a rapid acceleration. Now, this acceleration is probably the line that this would have taken if the New Deal had stayed as the New Deal was. We will next time in the next unit look at why this acceleration, but this is World War II. Right before World War II, what it looked like in all the economic indicators was that the New Deal had been successful. That this effort to take money, to spend ahead, put it in the economy, had lifted the economy, had recovered the economy, had put people back to work, and America was getting back on its feet economically. And so it appeared to be a success. Part of the success came from these enormous tariffs. So right through the New Deal and into World War II, we returned to an old-style Republican high-tariff environment, which meant that our industries were protected. Foreign goods were much more expensive than internal goods. But let's just look for a second at the cost of all of this. So here's a couple of charts that show that as well. How expensive do you figure it was? What do you figure it takes the federal government to invest in an economy to get it back on its feet? Percentage-wise. No idea. What would you guess?
The New Deal price? What are you saying?
Yeah, New Deal. Like what percentage? How much is the government now taking up space in this economy? These dollars that are being injected.
70?
Half? 70%?
75.
75%? Other guesses? I asked you earlier if you thought that the New Deal was a big government program because since the 1980s, the argument against the Democrats has been an argument against the New Deal. And there's been argument against big government and this big presence of government. And part of the perception, it was a perception at the time, and it's a perception that stayed, is that this was 70%, that this was about the government throwing everything it had and literally taking over the economy. This chart up at the top tracks in real time the government spending percentage during the New Deal. And so 1932, so we got in 1930 about 4%, that's what Hoover was spending. 1931 he goes up to about 5%. And then throughout the entire New Deal, federal spending never exceeded 10% of GDP. Never exceeded 10%. It was a minority of the economy itself. You can see it again in this chart. So between the dashed lines is the Great Depression. The red is federal spending as a percentage of GDP. The black is the federal revenue, so revenue and spending. And the green is whether if it's above the line, it's a budget surplus. If it's below the line, it's a budget deficit. So the New Deal, we could look at what happens during wartime. 30% of the budget goes to war. World War II, 40% of the budget goes to the GDP itself. We never came close to that in the New Deal. Never came. In fact, if you look at the trends up into the 90s and the noughts, we've spent more money, federal money, into the GDP in the present era than we ever did in the New Deal. It was a very small percentage. We'll look at it a couple other ways. So this is the percentage overall, never cracks 10%. This investment, so the investment hits in 32. You can see 32, 1933, there was a slight dip, but then that investment, just that 10% investment, accelerated the economy. Putting those dollars in those workers' pockets, spending money on public works that were needed, building electrical facilities, building roads, planting trees, doing all sorts of work on government land, public land, with public dollars that were borrowed. 10% of them ended up saving the economy. So we see, and this is just in real terms, it was trillions of dollars. It wasn't a small amount of money that the federal government was spending, but it was a small percentage of the overall GDP itself. And it just took a small amount like that to put things on its feet, to get things back on its feet. And the stability of some of these laws around the banking, so that people felt secure that the banks weren't going to take their money and run with it. And we can just see in one last that manufacturing employment, in fact, for the whole period, so if we just look at manufacturing, as soon as the New Deal started, as soon as FDR was elected, manufacturing employment started to come back. There were some other industries that took a little bit longer to get in there. So the New Deal was, one, not nearly as expensive as we remember. It ended up paying for itself. All of that money came back. Now, it did not hurt that World War II followed and we had this economic boom, but we were on track without a war to get back on solid footing with the New Deal itself, and it not being very expensive. Not expensive and successful. It accomplished what it set out to do, which was to stop the bleeding, stop the economic collapse, put people back to work, and get the economy back on its feet. And we can't, from this point forward, separate federal policy, banking policy, and economic policy in the economy itself. We come into the 20th century full on with our federal government enmeshed in our economic well-being. And if we go back and just look at the chart we started with, we'll see that that hasn't been the worst outcome in the world. We have not since, here we go. We have not since that dip in the 30s, we've not seen a depression since then. And that's a federal government that's involved in the economy. That's a federal government that's going, we need to change interest rates. We need to do things to make sure we keep it on a steady and even keel, because we had this enormous depression and it took this huge, we'll see this in the next unit, this huge injection of public money in World War II to get us back onto the track that we're on. And since then, policy has worked, so it's been a success all in all. I'll leave you with that today, and we will see you next Monday.